So we've had a look at reports, and let's now have a look at queries. So as a user of the library database, you probably don't want to have to go to, say, the borrower table each time you want to enter a new borrower or to update some information, and it's not a very nice thing to look at all the information in one row. So what a form does is it allows you to choose the layout and things like colours and fonts to define how that information appears on the screen. So let's create one and have a look. So if we go to the Create tab, and I'm going to use Form Design. You can use a wizard, but I'm going to show you all the properties and how to do it in exactly the way you want. So just like a report, you have different sections, and the properties that you get on the right in the property sheet, and if that doesn't appear, there's a button at the top right for you to enable that, depend on what you've got clicked. So you can click on the detail section, and that will give you one set of properties, and you can click on the section outside the detail, and that will give you a different set of properties. And just like a report, if you click the right mouse button, you've also got a choice of adding a form header. You can add a page header, but that doesn't really make sense in the context of a form, but form headers can be quite useful. So I'll add one of those, and we'll come back and look at that in a minute. So the first thing we need to do with a form, if we haven't used the wizard, is link it to a table or a query. We can bind the table, and that's where the information on the form is going to come from. Or if it's a form for entering new information, where it's going to be saved. So in this particular case, if I want to have a form for entering new customers or new members of the library, then that information is going to come from and be saved to the borrower table. So once I've selected that, I can then go to add existing fields, and I can see a list of those fields, and anything that I want to be on the form I can just drag and stick it on. So I'm going to drag membership number, forename, surname, address, gender, date of birth, and telephone. Actually, it's getting a bit small now. If you haven't got enough room, you can move the pointer over the kind of dividing bar and enlarge it a bit. That is going to be plenty of room. I just need to shuffle things up a little bit first. So a couple of things you notice. Firstly, these don't line up particularly nicely, but there are various options we can use to sort that out. So we can highlight a block of form controls like so, and we can right click. We can do things like align. So if we want them all to be lined up, we can do that. Either left, right, top, bottom. Obviously, if you line them up top, in this particular case, that wouldn't be very good. But if we line them up left, for example, we can see that it aligns them. You can also use the grid on the background, of course. And you've also got options in the layout section, which you can't see. Let's do it higher up. So layout, and so you can choose to put them in a table or to stack them if you want to make it a sort of a better grid. So you can then drag those and position them like so, and we can then resize that form. So just like the report, you probably don't want your form to be bigger than it needs to be. Okay, so that's kind of fairly tidy. We can do things like click the right mouse button and adjust the background colour. So I'm just going to make it a boring grey colour just so you can see that it's different. Maybe a little bit paler. There we go. So what you get by default is a transparent label and then a white background on your form fields where the data is going to be. Notice that as the label it uses the field name, so you don't necessarily want that to be in the same way. You might want to add capitals, for example, so you can just click in those and adjust the text. So I won't do those now while you're watching. The other thing that you might have noticed is that the gender field is rather large. So if we click on the View button to have a look at this, what you'll see is the reason for that is that it's used a thing called a list box where all the lists are visible, and you can select one. Some list boxes you can hold Control down and select more than one, but it doesn't let you do that. However, that does create a rather large box. So the problem with using that button at the top right to add existing fields is it tends to add them in a form that it chooses, and quite often it'll give you a text box, for example, when you don't want one. The only reason it's given me this list box is because I chose in the table to use a list box. So if I'd have just made it a single character text field, it would have given me a text box. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete that gender, and I'm going to back in design view. So I'm going to add in a different type of control. So we've got the selection of controls at the top that you can use on a form, and I'm going to use, instead, I had a list box last time, I'm going to use a combo box. So a combo box is a drop down kind of traditional multiple choice style list. So I'm just going to drag or click on there and then stick that on there. So when you do that, you get a wizard, and it asks you, do you want to look up the values, i.e. the choices in the list, from a table or query? Do you want to type in the list, or do you want to fill in the record based on the value I've selected in the combo box? So I don't want to find anything. I'm not going to bother with a query. I'm just going to type in the list. Okay, so on the next section, you can just type in the list. So I'm going to have obviously M and F as my two choices. At this stage, you can also resize that column. So it only needs to be as wide as the widest option in there. So and then you can add more columns if you want to. And then I'm going to click next. And then it's asking me what I want to do with that information. So the top option, remember the value for later use, is a little bit strange. What it means is it'll store the value in the form, and you can refer to it using things like VBA macros or perform calculations with it, but it doesn't actually store it. So the better second option is better. So store it means stick it in the database. And where do we want to put it? Well, that is it's the gender, isn't it? So we'll store it in the gender field, and then we'll click next, and it's asking what label would I like for that. So I'm going to click on I'm going to type in gender. So remember, the label is the just the bit of text to the left. So I'm going to say gender, and then we're at the end, so I'm going to say finish. Okay, so we can see now it says gender in it rather than unbound, and I can position that like so. Now, one of the strange things about the wizard is it doesn't give the control a name. So if we go back to the property list, on the other tab, we can see that each of the controls on the form has a name, and that's useful for if you're creating a macro and you want to refer to that field. So when we drag the address on it, it's called address, but although it asked us for a label when we were creating our gender combo box, it's called it combo 8. So what you might want to do is give it a more meaningful name. That's not too critical, particularly if you're not going to do anything with that in a macro, say. So I'm going to click on the view button now and show you the difference that's made. So now we've got a kind of standard drop down list, so you might prefer to do that. Now also notice what it's showing here is it's showing the first record, and we've got things called record selectors at the bottom, which allow you to move through the records. And then you've also got this thing down the side. Okay, so we'll have a look at that in a minute. So let's just go back to the design view. So if in the design view you go to format, so this is the design view once you've selected the whole of the form, so the bit outside the form area. So the default view is the default view of the information in the form. So you can choose a single form, so that means one record at a time, so it showed one person's details, or you can have it a continuous form, and what that means is it'd be like a table of information. I only ever use those top two, and in fact what you can do is you can disallow other views. So if you don't want people to look at data sheet view or pivot chart view, you can select those to set those to no. Other things that are useful in here are the navigation buttons at the bottom. If you don't want those, you can turn them off. So I'm just going to say no. And the bar up the side, up the left-hand side, was called the record selector. So we can turn those off if you like. If you've got a continuous, if you go for continuous and you've got like a table, you can choose whether you have lines between the records, and you can choose other options such as whether you've got close buttons, maximize, minimize buttons, etc. at the bottom, or at the top, sorry. And then what you can also do in other is you can choose how the form appears. So notice now if I switch to the view, it's kind of maximized within Access, so it fills the whole of that area. If you don't want it to do that, that's the thing that more recent versions of Access did, but if you go back to sort of Access 97 and Access 2000, it didn't. If you want your windows to kind of pop up, or your forms to pop up as a sort of window, then what you can choose is, if you just go back to the design view, so pop up, yes. If we look at that now, what we see is it pops up, and it's kind of a separate detached window, if you like, and that's how traditionally Access databases have appeared. And let's go back to the design view. So you might want that, or you might not. And modal, what modal means is, it's a bit like when you get an error message in Excel or in an application. Can you switch to another form while that one is open? So if you say yes, it means you can't switch to anything else in the Access database while that is open. So that's kind of the appearance. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to, so obviously resizing that only has an effect if it's a pop-up window, because otherwise it maximizes it to fill Access. The other thing it's doing, so when I view that, notice it's still showing the first record, even though I've got rid of my record selectors, so that's not particularly handy. But what I want this form to do is allow me to enter a new member. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the design view, and on the data tab you've got this additional option that says data entry. So you can turn off all sorts of properties. So you can say, no, I don't want people adding records, or I don't want people deleting records from this form. I don't want people editing anything. You can control that. So, you know, if you wanted people to just literally look at the information, you could say no edits, no deletions, no additions. But I'm going to say data entry yes. And what that does is it means when you open the form, rather than showing the first record from the table, it appears blank, ready for you to enter a new person. Okay, so if I click on the view button now, we'll see it's opened, ready for a new person. So I can type in a new lender's details by filling in the boxes. Now it's starting off with in the membership field, and we don't need to enter anything in the membership field. It's an auto number, it gets automatically generated. So what we can do is, if we go back to the design view, each of the fields or controls on the form also has a set of properties. So what we can do is, if we go to format, so we've got properties such as whether or not it's visible, and you might think, well, what's the point of putting it on there if you make it invisible? But sometimes you need things to be there to perform a calculation with them, but you don't necessarily need to see them. So for example, if you wanted to display on the form how old somebody was, you could generate that from the date of birth, but the date of birth would need to be on the form for you to do that. But then you've also got an option somewhere for enabled. I can't see enabled because it's actually on the data tab. So on the data tab, we can go to enabled and select no. And what that means is it still appears, but we can't select and type into that. So that you can use that for auto numbers because you don't need to do anything with them. So I'm going to click on the view now, and we can see that it's still there, but I can't select it. And that has the added benefit of meaning that the cursor starts off in the forename field. Now if you put these on in the wrong order, what we'll see, if I press tab now, the cursor will move between the fields, and it will go through them in the right order, because the order I added those fields in is the same as the order they appear on the screen. But if I was to go to the design view and jumble those up, the cursor would move between them in the order that they were added to the form. So it would be jumping up and down. So one of the things you can do as well on a form is click the right mouse button and go to Tab Order, and you can adjust that order to make it easier to fill in the form. So we can do things like that. We've looked at the colour. So what I would use the header and the footer for, and if we just there we go, I'm going to increase the size of those. What I would use those for is to put on things like headings. So I would probably think about this before I created my system, and I would try and create it in a consistent way. So I would say, oh, I'm always going to have my buttons at the bottom, I'm always going to have my headings at the top. So what I might do is have something like a label. So I'm going to say, just change the, I don't know, I'll say new member, and then I'm going to change the font size on that. So I'm going to make it say Arial, and I don't know, 24. And obviously I need to make that bigger. So in a software house, when I worked in the software industry, we did have teams of people deciding, all these little things, including how far apart the buttons should be and that kind of thing, just so that all the forms look consistent. And you can choose a colour. So I could have a navy blue heading. I can change a separate background. So I'm going to, I think it was that one I used. Yeah. And then I'm going to, at the bottom, I'm going to use the area at the bottom to put my buttons on. So what buttons would I want on here? Well, obviously I want to be able to save it, and if I don't want to save it, then I probably want to cancel it. So I would say probably at least 2 buttons. I would also think about consistency of language. So for example, if you want to close a form, you might call that close or cancel. But if you want to close the whole database, you might use a different word for that so people don't get confused. So you might use exit, for example, to close the whole database, close or cancel to just close a form, so people can see the difference between them. Okay, so the button is the one up here. So let's do saving first. So if I want to save this information, I'm going to draw on the button. I get a wizard that pops up. It asks me what I want that button to do. So saving is a record operation. Now this is a slightly strange case when you're adding a new record. So you could say save record, but what save record would do is save it to the database, but then just leave it there. So actually a nice thing to do in this particular case is add new record, because what that does is it saves the one that you're on and then clears the fields ready for the next one. Okay, so I'm going to choose add new record, and then you can have a picture or a text. So I'm a bit old school, so I just like text, and I'm going to call it save. One thing that's not clear from here is if you use an ampersand, again this might seem a bit old school, and then type in the word there. What the ampersand does is it underlines the next letter, and what that means is that you can use that letter then with a keyboard shortcut to operate the button. So if you do Alt S, it'll press this save button. So then I'm going to click next, and the next stage is to give the button a name. So unlike the combo box, it does actually ask me for a name. So I'm going to use a sort of naming convention where I start the name of the control with what it is. So I'm just going to call that button save, and then I'm going to choose finish. So I can then resize that and position it where I want. Probably the other thing I would want is a cancel button. That's a bit easier. So I'm going to say button and click the button on there. And so cancel is a form operation, and it's just closing the form. Okay, so I'm going to go next. I'm going to call that cancel. Oops. So I'm going to call that cancel with an underline on the C, so I can use Alt C, and then I'm going to call that button cancel. There you go, and finish. And again, you can tweak that, and you can use the alignment things on the buttons as well. So let's just have a quick check that that works. So I'm going to go to the view menu. I'm just going to call my person new member. So even though that field is not enabled or disabled, it's still working. It's still giving me the next number, and I'm going to leave all the other stuff blank. Or I'm going to say new member is a male, and then I'm going to click on save. We can see that it's, well, we can't see that it's saved, but we can see that it's gone, ready for the next person to come along. But if we look at the borrower table, well, then what we might need to do, if you just okay. Sometimes you need to just kind of refresh that table. We can see that new member has been added to the table, and we've got that extra row with all of the information from the table that we actually added. Okay, the other final thing is, if you've got multiple tabs open, then you might not want it to say Form 1 at the top. So that's the final property we'll look at. So if you go to your design view, on the Format tab, the caption is what it says on the tab. So if I just call this form new member, then when we look at the view, the data view, then we can see that it's called new member. So we've got multiple tabs open. That's easier to see. And then let's just try the cancel, make sure that works as well. So cancel, it's saying, do I want to save changes to the form, because I haven't saved that. So I haven't given it a name either. So I'm going to call it form new member. Because what you can also do is you can create a completely unbound form and just use that as a menu. So you can get it to automatically open when the database opens, and then just have buttons that take you to all of the other forms. So form new member. Okay, so let's just try that again. So form new member. Let's just try the cancel button. Yeah, so that's our form. It's a data entry form, so it appears blank, ready for a new one. I've got rid of the record selectors and the navigation buttons because I don't want those. I've got a header and a footer. I've got my title in the footer. Got a save button and a cancel button, and I've added some controls from the select existing fields option, but I've also added a kind of custom gender box.